Hey everybody, welcome to the video. So my final thoughts for week 15 of the NFL season over on Draftkings. And if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out and I really do appreciate it. And while you're at it, you might as well hit that notification bell as well so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. And YouTube tells me around 50% of the people watching these videos have not yet subscribed. So if you're a frequent visitor to the channel or if you're just new and you like what you see, consider that subscribe button because it really helps the channel grow. And that's obviously going to help me out as well. If you're going to follow me over on social media, my house is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And if you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, link is down below for that if you want to access into the entire sheet, cheat sheet, notes, projections, and all that fun stuff. Also posted a video for the 2-game slate tomorrow on Saturday, or if you're watching this video on Saturday, that is today. The slate starts at 4:30, so check that out if you want to. But I think that's it for the plug. So without further ado, let's dive into today's video. And as always, we'll start with the quarterback position. And not much has changed for me throughout the week. I did drop a couple of guys, but I did add one in the 5K range that we'll talk about in a little bit. But up top, we have Patrick Mahomes at $7,900, one of the MVP frontrunners. And this game should be an absolute shootout. I'm looking forward to it a lot. Also, getting Drew Brees back for the New Orleans Saints is going to be a big deal for the skill position players and Alvin Kumar and Michael Thomas. But we have a 52.5 point over-under this game and only a 3-point spread. So I'm expecting a bit of a shootout. Now, these defenses aren't that bad, but the offenses are just so good. It's really going to be hard to stop Patrick Mahomes, Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelsey, Drew Brees, Alvin Kumar, and Michael Thomas. So even though the defenses aren't awful, I think the offenses prevail here, and it should be a very exciting game. We're also in a bit of a mini primetime slot at 4:25 p.m., so I'm sure we're all going to be glued. Our eyes are going to be glued to that game. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure you guys are as well. The only problem is it's going to be pretty hard to stack up the Chiefs because they're all very expensive. Mahomes is just shy of $8,000. Tyreek Hill is close to $9,000, and Travis Kelsey is finally in the 8K range. So it's going to be very hard to stack up the Chiefs, but they're in a great spot. But I think that only makes them in play for tournaments. I don't think you have to absolutely jam in some of these Chiefs in cash games. And plus, the matchup is a bit tougher on paper. The Saints are second DVA versus the pass, and they're only allowing the third fewest points per game to the quarterback position. Now, I'm not one to really care about matchups when it comes to the Chiefs because as tough of a matchup it is versus the Saints, it's also an even tougher matchup for the Saints defense to be able to stop that offense. So even though both defenses are pretty solid in this game, we should have a shootout, and Vegas would agree. But I think really, Patrick Mahomes is only play for tournaments for me. If you can get up to him in cash games, sure, go for it. But I think we have a better cash game quarterback than Lamar Jackson this week. He's a bit cheaper. He's in a much better matchup versus Jacksonville. They have a higher implied team total. And he runs the ball a ton, which gives you a really high floor and also a really high ceiling. We saw that last week versus the Cleveland Browns. Like, Lamar Jackson's averaging under 200 passing yards per game this year, which is nearly half of Patrick Mahomes. Like, when Mahomes gets 400 passing yards, it's kind of something you expect at this point. He's been over pretty much 300 yards almost every single game this year. But Lamar Jackson doesn't really throw the ball too much. This is a run-first football team, but he's been running the ball quite a bit. I believe 5 of the last 6 games he's running the ball over double-digit times, and last week he had over 100 rushing yards, had 2 rushing touchdowns. Overall, a very phenomenal game for Lamar Jackson, had over 35 DraftKings points. And on the season, close to 70 rushing yards per game, half a rushing touchdown, 6.3 yards per carry. With this matchup versus Jacksonville, it's absolutely excellent. They are dead last, 32nd DVA versus the pass. Now, I'm not really concerned of how they are versus the pass when it comes to a guy like Lamar Jackson, but fortunately for us, they also struggle on the ground as well. So either way, it's a great matchup for Lamar Jackson. They're also allowing the 4th most points per game to the quarterback position with nearly 24 DraftKings points per game. So Lamar Jackson, he's in an absolutely fantastic spot, and they're 12.5 point favorites here, which might be a bit concerning. But again, I'm not really too concerned about Lamar Jackson airing the ball out. He's just going to run the ball pretty much all game, and also Trace McSorley's hurt, so is RG3. So they're going to need him on the field, so I think Lamar Jackson is definitely not fantastic. Also, the Ravens need to win games to get into the playoffs, so they're playing highly motivated as well. So he pretty much checks each and every single box for me. But dropping down to the mid-range, we have Jared Goff at $6,300 in a very soft spot versus the New York Jets. They're not trying to win football games, so I imagine the Rams can surpass their implied team total, or at the very least reach it. Now, the only concern here for Goff is that they are 17.5 point favorites at home, meaning this game should be a blowout fairly quick. Now, if the Jets keep it competitive, Goff can have a very big game, but the Rams defense is very good, and the Rams offense can certainly put up points, and the Jets defense really can't stop anybody. So I do have concerns here. We saw it last week with Russell Wilson, where Geno Smith ended up getting into the game late in somewhere in the 4th quarter. I forget when Geno Smith exactly came in, but again, it limits your upside if you're not going to play the entire game, nor if it's going to be competitive. It could be a big K-makers game. So that's the only concern here with Jared Goff. But at that price point, if he can get around 300 yards and 2 to 3 touchdowns in like the first 3 quarters, that's good enough for me at that price point. And the matchup versus the Jets are allowing the second most points per game to the quarterback position, nearly 25 points per game, close to 300 passing yards, and also 24th DVA versus the pass, which is actually improved because they were 32nd DVA versus the pass, I believe, the past couple of weeks. Now they're up to 24th, so I guess props to them, but this is still not a defense you should be concerned about at all. So I definitely have interest in Jared Goff. I'm just concerned about them being 17.5-point favorites at home, but they do have one of the higher implied team totals on the slate. You know who to stack with Jared Goff. It's Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. Pretty condensed offense for the most part. And then dropping down to the cheap quarterbacks, we have Drew Brees at $5,900. He's a new addition here because we just had news about a couple of hours ago that he is expected to be activated off the IR and start on Sunday's game. Now, I know he's not the most exciting quarterback in the world. He's 41 years old, but it just makes me like the skill position players more than Alvin Kumar and Michael Thomas, and he's cheap enough where I do have interest in a game that should be a shootout. Now, the matchup versus the Chiefs is kind of more of a mid-range spot here. They're 18th DVA versus the pass, and they're 18th versus quarterbacks. But if you just want to stack up the Saints offense and run it back with one of the Chiefs guys, it's a bit of a cheaper stack, and I feel like they have similar upside, although I would say the Chiefs have a much higher ceiling. But still like that price of Drew Brees, and if he can get you like 250, 300 passing yards and a few touchdowns, I don't think that's a bad play, and what should be a very high-scoring game. Then Jalen Hurts at $5,900. It's the same price tag as Drew Brees, but I feel like this floor is a bit safer here because of the rushing upside that he offers us. Because last week versus the Saints, pretty tough matchup. I already went over that when we talked about Patrick Mahomes, allowing the third fewest points per game. He had over 23 points in that game. Not really due to what he did through the air. Only had around 160 passing yards and one passing touchdown, but he ran the ball 18 times in that game and had over 100 rushing yards. If he can do that weekly, not saying he's going to go over 100 rushing yards every single week and run the ball that much, but if we even get half of that, 50 rushing yards, maybe 60, 70 rushing yards with a touchdown or two and close to 200 yards through the air, that's good enough for me below $6,000. It's kind of like a Lamar Jackson line, but we're not paying the premium of Lamar Jackson. Now, the matchup versus the Cardinals, it's obviously much tougher than the Jacksonville Jaguars, one of the worst defenses in football, and they're only allowing the 12th fewest points in the quarterback position. They're 9th DVA versus the pass, but I like the spot overall given the price tag and what Jalen Hurts can do on the ground. Plus, they're 6-point dogs here, so assuming they're trailing, he should be scrambling the ball quite a bit and hopefully throwing the ball 30-plus times in this game. And this game should be pretty fast-paced as both the Eagles and the Cardinals are playing at a decently fast pace this season. As you can see, they're both, or not both, actually all three sections here are solid green, meaning this game should be the fastest-paced game of the quarterbacks that I've been talking about. So, Hurts, 49-point over-under, 6-point dogs. I think he's in a pretty good spot to hit value at $5,900 once again. And then with that being said, we move on to the running back position. I don't have a large group of running backs to talk about this week, but I kind of like that because it just kind of condenses the group down, and we don't have so many options to talk about. But up top, we have the big dog this week, and Derrick Henry at $9,500. Went absolutely off last week, and kind of a similar scenario versus the Jaguars where they were big favorites. They weren't at home last week, but they had one of the higher implied team totals on the slate. And the thing with Derrick Henry is he doesn't really catch the ball much, so it always makes it a bit of a tough play on Draftkings because I just hate rostering guys that don't really catch the ball because it's a PPR site. But if he's going to get the ball around 30 times in this game as an 11-point favorite at home versus one of the worst defenses in football, you can sign me up all day for him, even though he's very, very expensive. But I think there's enough value on this slate to make it work. But it's kind of the same exact play as last week, where he was a large favorite, had one of the highest implied team totals, and he's playing one of the worst defenses in football. Because the bad thing with Derrick Henry, like I said, he doesn't catch the ball. So if they happen to fall behind, he's kind of going to get phased out like we saw versus Cleveland, where you can't just run the ball 30-plus times because they're trailing. He's not much of a pass catcher, and they're not going to dump the ball off to him 10-plus times a game like they do with Alvin Kumar over in New Orleans. But that shouldn't be the case this week. I think we see a similar scenario to last one, and I think he absolutely smashes once again. The matchup versus Detroit's great. They're allowing the second most points per game to the running back position. They're 26 DVA versus the run, and I think it's just an absolute smash spot for him. I know he doesn't catch the ball, but I don't think he's going to have to in this game. I think we could see around 200 rushing yards in this game and probably gets into the end zone once or twice and probably sees around 30 total touches. Plus, Titans need to win games to get into the playoffs. And he's on his quest to 2,000 rushing yards, which I think he has to average. I think I saw around 150, 155 rushing yards a game the next 3 weeks to do it. And he certainly is capable of doing that because if you look at his matchups, they're actually very, very easy. So I'd not be surprised. So he's got motivation. They need to win the game. It's a great spot. He checks every single box for me. I'd say he's one of the guys you want to build around this weekend. Then dropping down to more so of the mid-range, we have Alvin Kumar at $7,400. So I had some interest in him in tournaments with Taysom Hill being the quarterback. That was the assumption. But since Drew Brees is back at $7,400, you can make a case for Alvin Kumar being the RB1 on this slate versus Kansas City. They've always struggled versus the run. This year, they're 30th DVA versus the run, and they're 21st versus running backs, also allowing nearly 50 receiving yards per game to the position. But all systems should be good to go again for Alvin Kamara with his quarterback back because he is going to dump the ball off to Alvin Kamara. We saw that all season long. Taysom Hill got away from that. Now, the game before this, Taysom Hill actually threw in the ball 10 times, which was by far the most he has ever done. So I thought maybe we were trending in the right direction there. But with Drew Brees back, there's no concerns. We know Alvin Kumar is probably going to get around double-digit targets in this game. Should be a very high-scoring game. They're 3-point dogs here. So this kind of sets up well for a big Alvin Kumar game. I'd say he's one of the best plays on the slate here. So on the season, he's got around a 23% target share and close to a 40% weighted opportunity share and roughly 7 targets per game. But keep in mind, about a month or so of play with Taysom Hill is definitely going to put those numbers down a bit. So if you take those out of the equation, we're looking at close to 10 targets per game, closer to a 30% target share. So I definitely love Alvin Kamara here. We should get around 10 to 15 touches on the ground, and I'd say anywhere from 8 to 15 targets, and that's good enough for me at that price point, which should be the best game of the week. Then Jonathan Taylor at $7,200. He's had 2 back-to-back really good games, and the volume's trending in his direction. This is another great spot versus Houston. The Colts also have one of the higher implied team totals on the slate at nearly 30 points this week, and this game also features a 51-point over-under, and they're 7.5-point favorites at home, which always sets up well for that home running back. But the matchup here versus Houston is absolutely great. They're allowing the most points per game to the running back position. They're also 29th DVA versus the run, close to 140 rushing yards per game and over 1 rushing touchdown. They also let David Montgomery in the opening play last week score an 80-yard rushing touchdown. Not saying that's going to happen again for Jonathan Taylor, but they're just so bad versus the run. I can see a big game once again for Taylor, although we are paying a premium for him. He was below $6,000 last week, and now we're paying over $7,000, but the matchup's great. The volume's trending in his direction. He should get a couple of targets as well, and very good spot here for Taylor. Then Cam Akers, kind of similar to Jonathan Taylor. His numbers are trending in the right direction as well. He's had over 20 carries in back-to-back games. And he had 31 total touches in that last game versus the New England Patriots on Thursday night. Now, the matchup versus the Jets, they're not that bad versus the run. They're 8th DVOA, but they are allowing the 20th most points per game to the running back position and close to 100 rushing yards per game and over 6 catches. But the reason I'm interested in Cam Akers here is, 1, because of the volume he's been getting the past 2 weeks and he's a good running back, but 2, they're 17.5-point favorites at home here. So it should be a run-heavy game script in the second half of this game. I could see Goff in the air attack doing some damage early on, but at the end of the game, I think they're going to rely on their running backs. Now, the problem is, if they're up by a lot, since Cam Akers is pretty much the new RB1 in this offense, it could be more Henderson and Malcolm Brown than we'd care to see if we do roster Cam Akers, but overall, I still think he's a very solid player if he's going to get his 20-plus touches versus the Jets defense, and I'd have a hard time seeing him not get into the end zone as well, assuming he gets that many touches once again. Then J.K. Dobbins, he was not on my last video in the first look, but I did add him here at $5,900. It's just, I hate playing running backs from this backfield because they have to share between J.K. Dobbins, Mark Ingram, and Gus Edwards, plus have to share with Lamar Jackson as well. So it's really frustrating rostering this backfield, but they're 12.5-point favorites at home here. They have a applied team total of 30. The Jaguars' defense is absolutely atrocious. They're 24th DVA versus the run, and they're allowing the 4th most points per game to the position. And J.K. Dobbins is definitely the best running back in this backfield, averaging 5.3 yards per carry. It's just the volume. It's never going to be where you want it to be. But if he can get you around 15 touches and find the end zone, I think he's going to be a solid play right below $6,000. Then Leonard Fournette, $4,500. So I guess this is a big news player because I definitely did not have him in my first look video because we didn't know we didn't know Ronald Jones was going to get COVID. Now we knew Jones was going to have a procedure on one of his fingers. I forget exactly which finger it was. Not that it's important anymore, but he's not going to play in this game due to being put on the COVID list. So that means Leonard Fournette is in line to be the starting back here. Now I know he was inactive last week, so I think people might think it's going to be like the McCoy and Bond show. But I believe Byron Leftwich hinted at Leonard Fournette going to be the lead back here. And at $4,500, I'm certainly going to have interest here versus Atlanta. He's also been the pass-catching running back in this offense as well. Now, Atlanta's actually been of a pass-funnel defense where the running backs have not been that good versus them. They're actually 4th DVA versus the run, and they're only the 6th fewest points per game to the running back position. Although they're still allowing nearly 6 catches per game to running backs, and they've always kind of struggled versus pass-catching running backs, although this season they definitely have improved there. But at $4,500, if he gets around 15 touches, if not more here, it's going to be hard to pass him up at $4,500 as they're 6-point favorites. And they have a team total of nearly 28 points this week. So Fournette, assuming he's going to be the lead back here and get the majority of the touches and play the most snaps, that's kind of a steal at $4,500. And I think a lot of people will play 3 running back lineups and they'll just plug him in the flex spot, especially in cash games. So moving on to the wide receiver position. Up top, we have Tyreek Hill at nearly $9,000. He's super expensive, so I'm not even going to go close there in cash games because, look, I think he's a tremendous play. He can get you around 60 Draftkings points any given week. We saw that earlier this season versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Is that the likely scenario? Absolutely not. That's one of the best fantasy games of all time. I'm just saying he has the upside for that. The matchup versus New Orleans is pretty tough here. Oops, sorry, my screen did something else. But their second DVA versus the pass and only allowing the 8th fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. Now in the slot here, he's got a big wide receiver versus cornerback matchup advantage, but he's going to play all over the field. He plays in left side, slot, right side, whatever. They're going to line up everywhere, but he can burn any defender, so I don't really care who he's going to be matched up against, but I just can't get past that price point, so it's going to make him a tournament play only, but obviously he's the guy you want to pair it with Patrick Mahomes outside of Travis Kelsey. On the season, about 9 targets per game, over a touchdown per game, and he had off 13.3, close to a 40% market share of the team's air yards. You know what you're getting with Tyreek Hill. You're getting a burner, but in most years, you always kind of view Tyreek Hill as a bit of a boomer bust play, although he doesn't really bust, but like for Tyreek Hill busting like around 10, 12, 13 points, something like that. But that really hasn't been the case this season. Tyreek Hill is getting so many targets. He's scoring each and every single week, it seems like, and he hasn't had a bad game since that week. I think it was week 5 versus Buffalo where he scored 5.5 fantasy points. Outside of that, he has been consistent every single week. So if you had the money for him, great. In cash games, I would stick with some of these mid-range wide receivers because if you're paying up for Derrick Henry and Alvin Kumar, I'm telling you right now, you're not going to be able to afford Lamar Jackson in addition to Tyreek Hill if you happen to go that route. So I think he's a good play in tournaments, but I can't get there in cash games. Michael Thomas is $7,200. So he was actually putting up somewhat decent numbers with Taysom Hill, but now that he's got his quarterback Drew Brees back, at $7,200, it almost feels like a steal here for Michael Thomas. Now the Chiefs' defense versus wide receivers this season, it's definitely not something you're excited about. They're allowing the second fewest points for the end of the position despite being 18th DVA versus the pass, but I expect this game to be a shootout. And Michael Thomas, we know he's a talented wide receiver, and he runs a lot of short routes, so we know he's going to get peppered with targets here, and he should be fine in a PPR format like Draftkings. So at $7,200, I definitely have quite a bit of interest here, and in a game that should be an absolute shootout. Then Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, both these guys are pretty much the same plays. I say it each and every single week. They have the same ADOT, they have similar targets, they have similar market shares of the team's air yards. Everything's pretty similar for these guys besides Cooper Kupp getting a little bit more targets per game, about 1.5 more targets per game than Robert Woods. And I think that's kind of factored into the price tag of why Cooper Kupp's always a little bit more expensive. But I say it every time, since they're the same exact play, I always go with the cheaper guy. So I would say I prefer Robert Woods over Cooper Kupp. But if you want to play both, I think that's fine. I just think their upside might be a bit limited here because I don't think they're going to have to throw the ball too much in the second half with them being 17.5-point favorites. But it's a great matchup. The Jets really haven't been stopping wide receivers this season. On the year, they're 27th versus wide receivers, allowing close to 200 receiving yards per game, and they're 24th DVA versus the pass. So it's a great spot for them. I think their price tags are fine. Again, I'm just a little bit concerned about them not really throwing the ball too much in the second half, or they might even just not play as well. They want to bring in backups. Then Brandon Ayuk at $6,300, I'd say he's one of the best plays on the slate. The price tag's fine. I know Deebo Samuel, so it's definitely going to open up some things for Ayuk. He had 16 targets last week when Deebo Samuel exited, and he hasn't had a bad game in quite some time. If we're looking at his game log recently, he had 24 points last week versus Washington, which was a pretty tough matchup. They've been tough versus wide receivers all season. Buffalo, he had 20 points. New Orleans in week 10, he had 19. Then week 8 versus Seattle, he had 23 points. And then before that versus New England, he had 20.5. I had to skip some weeks because he didn't play in those games. But yeah, he's been having a pretty good, I was going to say a month or so, but that's actually dating back a couple months ago back. But past like 4 or 5 games, Brandon Ayuk has been absolutely excellent. I think that continues here versus Dallas. They've been awful versus wide receivers all season long. Looking at their numbers, they're ranked 25th versus wide receivers and 25th DVA versus the pass, and close to 2 receiving touchdowns per game. And with no Deebo Samuel, I would not be surprised if Ayuk sees around 10 to 15 targets in this one in a fantastic matchup, and I like that price point. So definitely in on Ayuk here. Brandon Cooks at $6,000. I did not have him on my last video, but since he's going to be good to go for this game, I was getting to thinking about it, and it just kind of makes sense because it's a 51-point over-under in this game, meaning there should be a lot of points being scored. Now, they're 7.5-point dogs here, but that should mean it's a pass-heavy game for the Texans, and that's kind of been the case all season long. They really can't run the ball too much. So if that's going to be the case, I think Cook should see 10-plus targets. We know Will Fuller is going to be out, and it's not a surprise anymore, but $6,000 being the wide receiver 1 for Deshaun Watson, that sounds pretty good to me. So it just makes sense from a game flow point of view, or perspective, I should say. Something like that. Both mean the same thing, but 7.5-point dogs when Deshaun Watson's good in garbage time. I think he just makes sense if they're going to be trailing all game long. Now, the Colts are 6th versus the pass, and they're now in the 9th fewest points in the wide receiver position, but this is mainly just a volume play and game script play. Then T.Y. Hilton on the flip side of this game at $5,500. He's kind of been awful all year long until the past few weeks. He's definitely starting to brighten back up. In just the past 3 weeks, he's scored 4 touchdowns, and before that, he hasn't scored a touchdown all season long, and he gets a great matchup here versus Houston. He's always had a good track record versus Houston, And actually, just a couple of weeks ago, Week 13 versus the Texans, he had 110 yards, 1 touchdown, and 11 targets and 8 catches on his way to 28 DraftKings points. Not saying he's going to do that exactly again, but if we know it's a good spot, Houston's defense has been awful this year. The Colts have one of the higher implied team totals on the entire slate, so good spot. They're 24th versus wide receivers and the 30th DVA versus the pass. So Hilton's a fine mid-range wide receiver this week. Then if you need a cheap option, I originally liked Bowden, but it sounds like Parker, Gesicki, and Grant all might play, so it kind of kills those plans. If they all happen to be out, yeah, we can go back to Bowden, but as of right now, it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. So Michael Gallup here at $3,500, I'd say he's the best cheap wide receiver to use at this point. It's not pretty here, and San Francisco isn't that bad versus wide receivers. They're allowing the 12th fewest points per game to the position, and their 10th DVA versus the pass. But Gallup, he plays pretty much all the snaps here, which is all you can ask for at $3,500. Plus, he's involved in the offense. It's not like we're like hoping for a target or two. He tends to get targets most weeks. If we're looking at his game log, 6, 11, 8, 5 targets the past 4 weeks. So that's good enough for me at that price point. I just feel like he's a bit too cheap, even though the matchup versus the San Francisco 49ers is not that great. Then moving on to the tight end position, it's not really that great of a position this week, so I have a expensive guy, a mid-range one, and a cheap option, just depending on your roster build. But starting up top with Travis Kelsey, I say it every time, it's going to be hard to fit him in, but if you have the money for him, go for it, because he's obviously the best play at his position by far. I say the same thing with Devontae Adams pretty much every single time he's on a main slate, but yeah, if you got the money for Kelsey, go for it. He's one of the league leaders in receiving yards this season as a tight end. That's just how good he's been this year. 9 targets per game, about 7 catches, close to 100 receiving yards, about a 25% target share. Seems to find the end zone more often than not. Now, the Saints, they haven't been that forgiving to tight ends, the 13th fewest points per game, and their second DVA versus the pass, but I don't care about matchups at all with Travis Kelsey. Like I said, if you had the money for it, go for it. I'd prefer him over Tyreek Hill just because you can save $800 and you can get very similar production there, although Travis Kelsey can't really pop off for 60 fantasy points like Tyreek Hill can because he's not normally going to score an 80-yard fade touchdown. But Kelsey's a very safe play. Mark Andrews at $5,500. If I had to pair anybody up with Lamar, it would be Mark Andrews, but you don't necessarily have to pair anybody up with him. He's a quarterback that you can play naked pretty much every single week because he just doesn't really throw the ball too much. But Andrews, I think he's an overall safe play here. I'd say he's the most likely guy to catch a touchdown, over half a receiving touchdown per game this year, close to a 30% mark. I shared the team's air yards, about 6 targets per game and 50 receiving yards. Again, when you compare a lot of these numbers to Travis Kelsey, he's just in a league of his own when it comes to the tight end position. But Mark Andrews is a solid tight end. And the matchup versus Jacksonville, their 32nd DVA versus the pass, and their 21st versus tight ends, allowing nearly a receiving touchdown per game to the position. So I think Andrews is a solid play that could find the end zone. Then Cole Kmet at $3,000. I think he's going to be the highest owned tight end on the slate, as crazy as that sounds, but he's had back-to-back weeks with 7 targets, and he's at $3,000. So yeah, you can sign me up for that. He's going to allow you to fit in the top dogs this week, like Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, Tyreek Hill, whatever you prefer. And tight end's usually a position I like to save money at, and if Kmet's going to give me 5+ targets in a good matchup versus Minnesota, I would take that all day. They're kind of mid-pack versus tight ends, but he's $3,000. He's on the field. He's getting targets. He's out-snapping Jimmy Graham. He definitely makes sense to me from a roster construction standpoint to be able to fit in those studs at the running back, quarterback, or wide receiver position this week. Then moving on to the defenses, they're kind of hard to project, but I mostly just try to pick favorites here. But up top, we have the Rams, and I think this is self-explanatory. They're facing the Jets, and they have a applied team total of 13 this week, which is, I think, the lowest we've seen all season long. Plus, the Rams' defense is pretty good, so yeah, that makes sense if you had the money for them, although I don't really see myself spending it for defense. The Titans' defense, they make sense just as a correlation play to Derrick Henry, because if you're playing Henry, you need the Titans to be playing with a lead, and they're 11-point favorites at home here versus Detroit. That might be without Kenny Golladay and Matthew Stafford, so can't really see the Lions putting up too many points here, and it just makes sense to play them with Derrick Henry. Buccaneers are going to be facing the Falcons without Julio Jones, so we know how bad Matt Ryan is without Julio Jones. He's been pretty bad even with Julio, so when you take him out of the equation, it gets even worse. And the Buccaneers' defense is overall solid, although they've definitely skidded some of these games recently, but they're 6-point favorites here, and team total 21 against them isn't too bad. On the Cardinals defense, I know I kind of have some interest in Jalen Hurts here, but overall I don't think we're really too scared about the Eagles offense this season, even though Hurts does give them some life and they're only $2,900. But that's kind of it for the defenses. It's kind of just play whatever fits at the end. If you can get one of these defenses in, sure, that's great, but if not, I don't think it's that big of a deal. But that's going to be it for this video, guys, so I hope it was helpful. If it was, make sure you leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. I really do appreciate it. Follow the social medias if you want. If you support the channel over on Patreon, like I said earlier, link is down below for that. But I think that's it. I'm going to get out of here and hope you guys enjoy the start to your weekend.